on the recent U.S. military operation in Venezuela, which led to the seizure of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. I'm Zhong Shi, joining you from Beijing.
Thank you, Songqi. This program is co-hosted with teleSUR, a Latin American multi-state network headquartered in Caracas, Venezuela. My name is Belén de los Santos, and it's a pleasure to join you from our studios in Havana, Cuba.
Belén, great to have you on our program today. We also have 4 other guests joining us. Marcus Vinicius de Freitas, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Marco Fernandez, Geopolitical Analyst at Brasil de Fado. Honor Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And Wang Xingsong, Professor at Beijing Normal University. Thank you all for being with us today. I do want to start with those U.S. strikes themselves. And Belén, why don't we start with you on that front? Well, President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores are now in New York, where U.S. authorities say they will face criminal charges related to alleged narco-terrorism conspiracy. Accusations that Maduro denies. Belén, get us up to speed on the latest situation in Venezuela. Have there been any palpable changes in the country? What are people talking about at this point?
Well, I think that we need to speak to first the sentiment of the population. First of all, we need to understand that even though we can go to the past that Latin America and the Caribbean has in terms of U.S. interventions, we need to understand that for most of the region that has been deemed a region of a zone of peace, for most of the past decades and for the current generations, this is a first. We are speaking of a red line that has been crossed, and that means that for the population in Venezuela, we need to go back to that January 3rd. There was an attack that included bombings not only in Caracas, the capital, but also in the states of La Guaira, of Aragua, of Miranda. And this means that for the first time in their lives, this population woke up to explosions and bombing. So we need to really start from a human level to understand what this population is going through, just the commotion after such an event, that it had been so much announced. Also, Venezuela had been denouncing this before the international forums, before the UN Security Council, for example, stating that the United States is flagrantly announcing they will carry out an attack, and that even though this psychological war was ongoing, this is a first, and the people are just digesting this. Now, after that initial shock, we need to say that in terms of the population, we've been seeing and continue to see just up to this afternoon mobilizations, and mobilizations that are on the streets that have been massive. You've probably seen the images in social networks, and these are mobilizations that have one main demand, and that is the return of the constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro, and also the defense of the territorial integrity of the country. This has been prepared by the territorial forces. We were saying that this was an announced attack. So Venezuelans that have a very long history of territorial organization were preparing for coming out to the streets to defend what is them. So that those demonstrations are marking the time in Venezuela right now, that at a population level. And also in terms of institutionality, we need to keep into account that despite President Donald Trump coming out to say that they are allegedly running Venezuela or wanting to run Venezuela, the situation right now is not that. Venezuela has continued and maintained its institutionality. The National Assembly initiated sessions for the coming period. Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as acting president following the state of commotion that was announced previously by the presidential order of Nicolás Maduro. So Nicolás Maduro continues to be the president of the nation. Delcy Rodriguez, on behalf of the institutionality, is acting president, and that institutionality is still going strong. So that is a little bit of what is happening.
It is still a very touchy situation there, and everyone is watching if those commotions you mentioned will spiral into unrest or instability in the country. I don't want to turn to you now. The UN Charter explicitly prohibits the use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of another state. The big question now is, Will there be consequences now that the United States has clearly violated the core principles of the UN Charter and international law?
Well, John, you have to divide that into two parts. During the short term, the U.S. will prevail. Why? There's no country that's willing to go to war with the United States. It's almost impossible given the proximity of the U.S. to this area. It's not like you're going to float a bunch of battleships and aircraft carriers and take on the U.S. in its backyard. And they're certainly going to do whatever they're doing in terms of extorting oil from this country. What they've done is illegal. But the long-term consequences are going to be profound. I don't care what country pays lip service to Donald Trump. Every country in the world is now saying the U.S. is an aggressive, unreliable partner, and we have to de-risk from it. So in the back rooms of capitals all over the world, they're trying to figure out how they can be less exposed to the U.S. and protect themselves. For some small countries, they have no choice but to, as they say, pay lip service. But other countries are thinking, well, if the U.S. isn't reliable, we need a new world order.
Marco, can I bring you into this discussion now? How do you look at the consequences here, short term, long term?
The thing is, it's true that U.S. has no other power that can dispute in Latin America. But first of all, I think some of the reactions already started. So Brazil and Colombia were the most vocal against U.S. and Mexico as well, celebrating. I think this is one of the problems, because one of the problems we have in Latin America is that U.S. is not only like a major military power, but has huge influence in the elites of the Latin American countries. So most of our countries right now in the region are divided, are polarized between progressive center-left governments and right or extreme right governments. These extreme right governments, most of them are subservient to the U.S. And even the people, like white people, rich people from Latin America, they dream about living in Miami. They have green cards. They are proud to be sort of like semi-U.S. citizens. So I don't think this will change in the short term. But again, in the long term, I think U.S. is starting to shoot their own feet here, because this is dividing again. It's increasing the polarization, but it's also, I think, it will give more arguments to the progressive sectors, to the center left, who is against the imperialist aggressions in the United States.
Professor Wong, what is your perspective on this? We're coming up about a week after the seizure of President Maduro. It's still very early in these developments. What will be the legal, diplomatic, and political consequences for these U.S. strikes against Venezuela?
Yeah, I think legally, both in terms of international law and the domestic law in the United States, I think what President Trump has done to President Maduro is completely illegal and unlawful. And internationally, obviously, UN Charter Article 2 and Section 4 very clearly states that no country should threaten or use force against another sovereign state. And even domestically, and according to the War Powers Act from 1973 in the United States, the president does not have the power to initiate military actions without approval of the Congress. And President Trump has violated both international law of the United Nations and domestic law. But in terms of consequences, and we're into this world of the laws of the jungles, and impunity seems to be a prevalent principle right now, instead of respect for sovereignty and other principles of international laws. So what I'm saying is that I don't think President Trump is going to face very serious legal consequences out of it, despite the fact that we're seeing widespread condemnation from across the world against the behavior of American government that recently happened. But at the same time, this reaction is not on a consensus level, because you do have some countries whose right-wing parties, some of them are incumbent governments, are actually receiving a lot of support from President Trump and his right-wing politics in the United States. And I'm talking about many of the right-wing parties in Latin America as well as in Europe. So this means this world is being divided, and unfortunately, in front of such a violent and egregious behavior by American government, it doesn't seem that there's consensus in the international community, which I think is a great shame.
Following President Maduro's seizure, Venezuela's Supreme Court named Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as acting president, and President Donald Trump has warned that she would pay a very big price if she does not do what's right. Einar, how does the United States define what's right at this moment?
They have no choice. You have a large power that's already military intervened. I don't think you can go ratchet up tensions any more than taking the sitting president and his wife and spiriting them off to the United States. So at this point, they are in a position where they have to give in. She's already supposedly agreed to this idea that somewhere between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil will be given to the United States. But people who are watching this need to understand the nuances here. The big oil companies are not interested in Venezuelan crude. They moved away from it when they were beginning sanctions. They put $500 billion into the oil sands of Canada. They're not going to walk away from that. The only winner here are those who process oil, and a lot of them are in Texas and Louisiana, and they will benefit by having a close source, which they can buy at cheaper prices and then sell on the international market and within the United States. A lot of people are confused. Why does the U.S., which exports oil, need oil? It's because the U.S. has light crude, and in order to make diesel, you need heavy. And 60% of our refineries in the United States deal with heavy crude. So if you're going against Canada and you want a quick, easy supply, Venezuela is there. So what we're looking at is an imbalance within the United States in terms of their oil, but also politically. So I think this is something that people need to realize, that why this is happening. There's only a very narrow interest that is going to benefit this. The processors, everyone else is losing.
Marcus, let's get your take on this. America might want heavy crude, but it doesn't necessarily need Venezuelan oil. But it wants to have a say on who gets the oil from Venezuela, at what price, and under what terms. So where does oil factor in these U.S. operations against Venezuela? How important is it for U.S. to have the say here?
I think that I could recall a Chinese saying that says, you shoot a chicken to scare the monkeys. And the idea that the United States apparently has after the issuance of the security document is that they want to affirm that within the American hemisphere, the United States is prevalent and it's hegemonic. And this action is not an action by a hegemon, it's an action by an imperial country, right? That wants to identify and to be recognized as an imperial country. So oil is just a factor in that sense. And oil is just playing a role, like the United States is doing this because they can, because as Einar said, nobody's going to reverse that. We may complain about it, but it's very hard for you to go against, the power and strength of the United States in that sense. So I think that when you look into the actions that have been taking place, basically the message is clear. We might use that economically. We might, it may play a role, in our artificial intelligence, have access to oil and all this, but it's actually an act of imperialism and basically trying to say to any other countries, particularly China, that if they want to play a role in the region, they have to be careful because the United States is willing to use its force. And it's basically, the carrot and stick approach. But the issue here is that the United States is just showing the stick and nothing else.
As we talk about the aftermath here, it's important to understand how regional powers, regional countries are reacting to this. Also, governments across Latin America have responded in different ways, from strong condemnation to more cautious statements. Belen, what are the key dividing lines shaping these regional responses?
Well, we were just talking about the different reactions and the way in which some of the countries were condemning this aggression, this blatant violation of international law, the kidnapping of a president. And we've heard strong condemnation from Brazil's Lula, from Petro in Colombia, from President Sheinbaum in Mexico. So major players in the region condemning this aggression. And we need to understand this condemnation in terms of the entire region. Why is this important? Because we are talking about Venezuela, but these players are understanding that this is not just about Venezuela. It has to do with enhancing control over the entire region. You were just talking about the carrot and stick theory, and something like that is happening, and something like that will allow us to also to understand why there are other governments that are completely aligned with the U.S., and that is, for example, Argentina's Milei, and also President Noboa in Ecuador, for example. And we have had other kinds of intervention of the U.S. in those countries, interventions that go in the way of, for example, great amount of loans in order to ensure that those governments continue to follow their politics. So these are actually different ways of achieving one same objective, the control over what the U.S. appears to think is its own territory.
Professor Wang, it's interesting that we obviously have these different groups of countries and different categories of countries that are tailoring their responses to this crisis, mindful of their own interests and mindful of their relations with the United States. The question really now is, which countries will help shape the paths forward for Venezuela with their different responses? Your takes on those different responses and reactions?
Well, like I said earlier, I think it's a shame that some countries are even in agreement with what President Trump has recently done to President Maduro, a leader of another sovereign country. But at the same time, some colleagues were earlier discussing that the President Trump's administration is trying to kick out all these so-called external hostile forces from Latin America or Western Hemisphere, which I think doesn't make sense at all. Because if you look at the infrastructure building and the credits and loans being provided to development finance in Latin America over the past decade or so, it's China and other global South countries that have contributed so much to the development of Latin America. And I don't think the American government has the plan for the aftermath of what's going to happen after Maduro was taken away. Who is going to take care of the governance issues and economic issues in Venezuela? I think right now that you might have some corners of grievances in Venezuela against President Maduro, but as days go on, people will see that the governance issues, economic issues not being tackled by anybody. I also don't think American government has the capacity to tackle all these issues. And previously you had the USAID, which did a lot of work in terms of development and finance in developing countries, including Latin America. But now USAID is gone. And the American government simply doesn't have the capacity, the bureaucracy to deal with on-the-ground issues in Venezuela. So we're, pretty much looking at a very bleak situation in Venezuela sooner or later.
Marco, I just want to quickly have your thoughts here. If we look at the past U.S. interventions in countries like Iraq, does what's happening in Venezuela bear any similarities? Could Venezuela sink into the situation of Iraq here? And when you're watching out for that, what could that mean for the people in Venezuela and for the stability in the entire Latin American region?
Well, we hope not. We hope not. But right now, it's hard to say. I mean, as Marcos was saying, U.S. doesn't have a good record on intervening in countries and controlling the territory. Actually, they failed in Iraq. They failed in Libya. And to be honest, I don't think they will try this in Venezuela, because I think this will be a total disaster. And even for U.S. Public audience, if you see right now the polls, 70% of the people are against the intervention in Venezuela. So this could not be like sell in U.S. as, we're bringing freedom and democracy, which, by the way, actually this is one advantage of Trump. Let's be honest. I mean, Trump never talked about democracy. or like the Democrats would say, or even the Bushes would say, that we are fighting for democracy and we're fighting against terrorism. He's being very, very straight, very blunt. Like, we need the oil, and we don't want China and Russia or Iran or Cuba there. So we're going to intervene. And I think this is not for internal audience. I don't think it's as good. And also, let's remind that Trump is now picking a big fight with MAGA, and Trump cannot be elected without MAGA. If you see, for instance, Tucker Carlson, which is one of the greatest representatives of MAGA, his comments about Venezuela, he was actually saying the opposite. It's like, this is a big mistake. And giving some of his conservative arguments that Venezuela is actually the most conservative country in the region. Anyway, I mean, I don't agree with his arguments, but it's being clear that MAGA is not supporting this. And this is going to be a big problem for Trump in the next elections, because also it starts to have some rumors in U.S. that even Tucker Carlson could be a next name for MAGA for presidential elections. So I think at the end of the day, if there's a short term, maybe Trump is showing how strong he is, but I don't think this is going to be good for him in terms of his ambitions for next elections.
Belen, last November, the U.S. national security strategy signaled a return to the Monroe Doctrine, emphasizing American primacy in the Western Hemisphere. How have Latin American countries responded to this so far?
Well, I think that we need to go back to what we were saying before. This is not just Venezuela, it is the entire region. And this has been a motive of this new administration of President Donald Trump since it began. Let's recall that just weeks after taking office, he was talking about taking over the Panama Canal. Let's recall that it has had direct interferences in the elections of Argentina and Honduras, for example, that took place this year as well. Let's recall as well that it has had direct tariff wars and threats with Brazil just trying to incede in the jail process of former President Jair Bolsonaro, also with Mexico. I'm saying this to say that this is not just the only thing that is happening. It is maybe the most clear and blatant attack, but this is a whole strategy that has to do with taking control of the continent through different strategies and according to the different governments at play. So maybe this case is the most clear one, and that is why it's having this level of response. We've been seeing that Brazil and Colombia called for a CELAC summit, and maybe that would be the way to see if with this now we see more interaction between these partners in order to offer a unified response.
Everyone, I do want to zoom out a little bit for now and have you look at the grander scheme of things that Donald Trump is contemplating. After the operation in Venezuela, Donald Trump issued warnings toward other countries, including Cuba, Colombia, and Mexico. He has also said the U.S. should take over Greenland and could attack Iran again. Einar, is there a coherent strategy or coherent goal that ties all of these objectives together for the Trump administration?
Well, there's two. Short term, it's diversion, keeping the public away from talking about all the things Epstein, et cetera, the economic woes of the United States. On the second level, it goes back to the defense policy statement that was put out a few weeks ago, indicating that the U.S. believes that it's going to be a hemispheric hegemon, not a global one. But if for one instance you think that if the United States had a hegemony in its sphere, that it would just stay away from the rest of the spheres, I think you're sadly mistaken. If this was really true, you would see drawdowns of troops in both Europe and in Asia. Remember, there are 400 military bases by the U.S. that surround China and the Five Island chain, as they call it. So this is merely a head fake. Mafia politics being used in its most cynical form. It doesn't have a long-term positive outlook, given that so many countries will turn against it, but it is what Donald Trump is pushing as part of his idea of diverting attention and also, quote, making America great again.
All right, Marcus, coming to you now. I mean, it's unlikely that the United States will attempt all of these overly ambitious objectives at the same time, but will the successful operation in Venezuela embolden the Trump administration to pull off something similar in another sovereign state?
I think that we need to take into consideration that based on the current Constitution of the United States, Trump is a one-term president. And so I think that he's doing all these actions to try to, insert his name in history, like, Ramses II of Egypt, so that he's going to be remembered for the things that he did. Now, of course, it emboldens him with public opinion if he manages to, sell it right. And we have to understand that Trump is a television guy. He's a media guy. If you look into the way the whole situation was handled, it was like, a TV show for everybody to watch President Maduro being held as a narco dealer. And I think that, Trump does that. Now, my concern is not, him repeating this, but my issue is that if his followers, if anybody that comes along the way, his successors, that could be Marco Rubio, Peter Hegseth, or even J.D. Vance, and if the Democrats do not come up with good names or different strategies, they might feel emboldened to do that. And as we observe the decline, and those are actions of a declining power. When you're declining, you start doing stupid things. And that was one of the actions that instead of helping the United States to solidify its image or to solidify its values, that you basically saw it as a declining power acting out of desperation in Venezuela, which at the end of the day was the weaker link in the whole process that you see him interacting in the world. He hasn't delivered in many places that he promised to do, and Venezuela was something that he could handle. But even after doing this, we still do not know the day after. So I think he might feel emboldened, but I think that overall, the message of an agonizing decline is there.
Finally, if you could send one message to the key parties involved, whether it be the United States, Venezuela, or the international community, what would it be at this critical moment? Belen.
Well, I would talk to our audience right now and just say that we have a lot of work to do in order to unpack and separate what Western media is saying and what Donald Trump is trying to impose from what is really happening, despite Trump saying that they are running Venezuela. That is not what is happening in the territory, despite Western media continue to bombard with headlines stating that if that leader was taken away, the situation would collapse. That is not what we're seeing in the territory. So we have to pay close attention, and also taking into consideration that this is happening after Gaza and that this is possible after what happened in Gaza and what Gaza showed the world. The fact that the international community could not enforce its own international laws, and also the power of mobilization. So we need to continue to look at what is happening across the world and the pressure that demonstrations both across the world and in the United States itself can cause to the U.S. administration itself for what it's doing, for pushing these red lines. Are they going to have some backlash?
And we do want to thank all of you for sharing your insights. The seizure of Nicolás Maduro has left Venezuela at a pivotal crossroads with so many uncertainties in its future. CGTN will continue to follow developments regarding the U.S. operation in Venezuela and its broader implications. And to our audience out there, thank you so much for watching.